Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about power imbalances, and then the idea of restorative justice, which might be a new idea to you, but is actually something very central or very important to this model and the way we understand treatment in this model. Now, one of the reasons for talking about power imbalance to begin with is because if you've listened to earlier episodes, or perhaps if you've engaged with this model previously, you'll know that this idea of covert control and power differential is very central to our way of understanding and defining deceptive sexuality. And it's one of the main reasons why we identify the secret sexual basement as an abuse victim trauma reality, beyond just a compulsive sexual issue or infidelity. And power and control become important things to consider throughout the recovery journey as well, because one of the things that can occur is that certainly for some of the clients that I work with who have engaged in deceptive sexuality and caused this kind of harm, they often then find themselves in a situation where they're actually feeling disempowered in the recovery work. They're perhaps having to follow a lot of pretty firm boundaries, for example, where it might feel like their voice, their opinions, their emotions just aren't welcome, like everything they say is wrong, they're always the bad guy, those kind of things. And so the recovery journey, particularly in the early stages, can feel like a pretty disempowering one. And then there's obviously a certain irony in the person that caused the harm feeling very disempowered when we are now identifying through the lens of this model that actually the partner was disempowered probably for a long period of time by the presence of the secret sexual basement in the first place. However, it is important that we honor those concerns as well. It's important that we don't fall into a situation where we're dehumanizing someone in treatment, whether it's the victim of the deceptive sexuality or the person that engaged in it. We don't want to dehumanize anyone. So I want to be very, very clear about that. We don't want to treat anybody as lesser than in this kind of work. With the men I work with, again, with the people who have built and maintained the secret sexual basement and have caused the harm, it is important that as treatment professionals, we're not falling into that trap of thinking that in recovery, that person needs to just sort of lose themselves, have no needs, no opinions, no emotions, any of that kind of thing. But we also rightfully want to honor the betrayed partner's need for safety and the intense trauma they're likely to be experiencing. And so going back to the starting point of today's episode, we sometimes need to zoom out and consider this power imbalance and how that goes throughout the phases of the secret sexual basement and of the recovery work. But then also this idea I'm going to introduce of restorative justice is the thing that really helps us frame how this should look or how we should consider this journey. Now, as a brief reminder, if we think back to the covert phase where the secret sexual basement is still active, the reason, and I talked about this a lot in the integrity abuse episode, the reason we talk about disempowerment of the partner is because there is reality manipulation occurring when there's a secret sexual basement. The integrity abuse behaviors are helping to hide the reality of the secret sexual basement from the people in the home above. And when we have key, potentially life-altering information about our reality held from us, we can therefore not make fully informed decisions. We cannot make the decisions that we might make if we had that information. And so in that case, covert control is occurring. My decisions are being covertly controlled by the person withholding the information from me. And so I am disempowered in that context. the intimate partner or the victim of the secret sexual basement, sometimes for a very significant period of time, even decades, is perhaps unknowingly living in a disempowered state. And this is one of the key reasons we identify this, again, as an abuse victim trauma issue, not just a sexual acting out issue. And then we come to the exposure phase, when the basement is either discovered or disclosed. The person that had been maintaining the basement up until that point, often out of a sense of desperation, will usually respond with ongoing trickled or staggered disclosures, minimizations, defensiveness, maybe anger, other behaviors that will continue to disempower the partner. The partner in that situation now knows that there is a basement, that something's occurred, but is often still in a continued state of reality confusion. They don't know what's true. They don't know if what they've been told is the full extent of the truth, or if there's still more to come. There's the ongoing reality fragmentation that I've talked about. So again, even though some of the information is known, there's generally still a high sense of disempowerment for a lot of partners. Now, when we're working with an issue that we've identified as an abuse issue, where there's an unhealthy power differential, it's imperative and actually ethically required that in the treatment, we are then working to eradicate that power differential. We're looking to empower that person as a prerequisite of safety and healing. In many ways, it's not going to be possible to heal if the person is still persistently disempowered. And in treatment, this often involves things like formal therapeutic disclosure, significant boundaries being requested, and the prioritization of the partner's needs. And that then brings me back to that point of how the men in recovery that I work with, particularly in the early treatment phase, might then perhaps end up in a situation where they're now feeling disempowered. He might feel like he's being controlled. He's having to follow potentially strict boundaries. He perhaps feels like he's losing his voice. And when we have a situation like this in treatment, it's important that we have a clear way to formulate it. We don't want to just accept this as a given and discount those concerns, because, as I said, that can quickly veer into dehumanizing somebody. And that's where we need to introduce this idea of restorative justice and really consider what that means. There are various forms of justice, but I want to specifically talk about two of them here: restorative justice and retributive justice. Retributive justice is based on punishment or revenge for a wrong or criminal act. So the person has done something wrong, they are now being punished for that. Whereas restorative justice is based on restitution and healing. When we're thinking restoratively, we're not just looking at punishing the person that caused harm, we're looking at restoration. And to be very, very clear, the DST model is a restorative justice model. It is not a retributive model. It is not about punishing the person who built the secret sexual basement. If we're thinking through the lens of retribution or retributive justice, we would typically ask things like, what law was broken, or what harm was caused? Who is it that broke that law? How are they culpable for that? And then, therefore, what punishment do they deserve? That's the logical progression of retributive justice. But when we're thinking from the perspective of restorative justice, we first want to advocate for the victim or victims. We want to ask them, how were you harmed? What do you need in order to heal or in order for justice to occur? And then we need to think about whose obligation it is to meet those needs. Who carries the obligation for justice or restoration? We also want to be curious about what are the causes of the harm in the first place? What needs to be changed for that harm to stop occurring? Who has the power to make those changes? So again, this is not about punishing someone for the harm that's occurred, but instead considering how we can move towards safety, restoration, and justice. We know that punishment can feel very satisfying in the moment, especially if we're the person that has been harmed or we're impacted by the harm that's occurred. But ultimately, it can feel like quite a hopeless endeavor. It doesn't really lead to healing, doesn't really lead to progress, to restoration. Whereas restorative justice has this vision of taking responsibility, but being able to move towards something more hopeful as well, or something more healing. And for the men I work with, thinking through this lens of restorative justice, it should involve things like taking responsibility for their own actions. Remember, one of the central questions is, who caused the harm? And another would be understanding what they've done and how it has impacted the other person. And that's one of the reasons that the information I'm trying to give on this podcast and the DST model, I think, in general, is so important. Until we can really understand what the issue is and the harm that's been caused and why this is such a harmful system, it's going to be pretty difficult to see any real justice or restoration. A restorative justice approach should also give somebody an opportunity to redeem themselves. Again, it's not just about punishing them, locking them away. It's about providing an opportunity for somebody to redeem themselves. And then also we should be thinking about avoiding further problems in the future. If you just focus on punishing people, does that actually help them grow and change? Does that stop the problems from happening again in the future? I think restorative justice is a very helpful and actually hopeful way to think about these things. I want to also briefly back to some of those other questions I mentioned that are inherent in restorative justice. So, how was the person harmed? How was the victim harmed? What do they need? And then whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And I want to add an important caveat that ultimately, people are responsible for their own healing in the sense that nobody can heal somebody else's trauma. That's something we actually talk about a lot in this model, this idea of attending, not fixing. We cannot fix or we cannot undo what happened, but we can attend well to it and provide the conditions where healing can occur. We can attend well to the people that have been harmed. So it's really important to keep in mind with that question, how were you harmed? What do you need? Whose obligation is it to meet those needs? That doesn't mean that the person that caused the harm, in this case, the person that engaged in the deceptive sexuality, heals the other person. It would be lovely to think that that's possible, but unfortunately it just isn't. It might not be fair, but we can't heal somebody else's trauma, even if we're the one that's caused it. But we can certainly provide conditions where healing can possibly occur. And that's where we can ask that question, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So the primary obligation for providing those conditions, for providing safety through the lens of restorative justice, is to the person that caused the harm in the first place. Again, the person in this context that had the secret sexual basement, the person that engaged in the integrity abuse behaviors, it is primarily their obligation to meet those needs of providing safety, providing the conditions where healing might be possible. And so that is very much the lens we are looking through in this work. It's not about dehumanizing or making someone lesser than. We know that actually one of the main problems of the secret sexual basement is how dehumanizing it is to the betrayed partner or to the people in the home above. So the last thing that we want to do in treatment is to just flip that on its head and dehumanize the other person. That being said, we do talk about this idea of him or the person that built the basement being one down in the recovery journey. And that's what I've alluded to a little bit on this podcast. This feeling that many people doing this treatment might have of being one down. And I really want to validate that. Through the lens of restorative justice, that actually is the case in a sense. But I also want to really clarify again what is meant by that to avoid any confusion. It is natural if there's been years and years, maybe even decades, of the partner being implicitly one down because of this covert control and power differential, that to redress that power imbalance in treatment, which we're saying is his obligation, then there is this clear sense of him being organically now in a one-down position in that early recovery journey. The partner's safety is being prioritized, and so his obligation to meet those needs of safety is also being prioritized. He's organically in a one-down position in that sense, and a position of needing to make restitution where possible for that harm that was caused. But I hope you can hear in this the clear difference between what I'm saying there about being organically one down in recovery and having an obligation to focus on safety and restitution versus saying that somebody is, or implying that somebody is lesser than, or dehumanizing the person. On the contrary, I want all of the work I do with the men I work with to be very honoring of the journey that each person is on, whilst also maintaining the truth and reality of the harm that's been caused. I really want to see my clients moving towards a situation where they're able to use their voice authentically, where they're more in touch with their needs, their wants, their feelings. So not lesser than, not suppressing all of those things, but actually drawing them out in a healthier way. And I think a lot of that is pretty clear in the conversations I've had with Dr. Minwala about the integrity, intimacy, integration, about healthy masculinity and what that might look like. So very, very much not about being lesser than or suppressed, but about honoring the harm that's been caused, honoring the role in understanding that harm and providing restitution and justice where it is possible. And that's going to mean, in many cases, for a period of time, there is a power that needs to be given up. There are boundaries that need to be followed. There are things like therapeutic disclosure. There is a focus on validation and empathy for the partner's experience, perhaps at the expense of my desire to share what's going on for me sometimes. So all of that, I think, can be correctly understood through this lens of restorative justice, of being organically one down in that early recovery stage, and then perhaps moving towards an equality in the long run that is based upon safety, restitution, justice. And so I hope that's helpful in clarifying some of these challenges that might come up. And as with many things I talk about, it is a big topic in many ways. There are lots of nuances, and in each relationship, in each case I work with, there are going to be important contexts to consider. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And this is also a journey that is really difficult to balance correctly sometimes. Sometimes it can go too far one way or the other. But I just want to finish today by repeating something I said earlier, to be as clear as I can be. The DST model, the deceptive sexuality and trauma model, is not a retributive treatment model. It is not about punishing the people who are engaging with this kind of work, this kind of recovery journey. It is a restorative treatment model that aims to move towards justice and healing. And I think that when we understand it through that lens, we can see why the power differential might seemingly flip on its head in many ways, but also how we can humanize all of the people in the process. We can honor the harm that's been caused to the partner, and we can honor the journey that the person who engaged in the deceptive sexuality in the first place is on, especially when they are diligently doing the work of restoration and justice. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.